Welcome to a Wednesday with Clear Mountain and Longpor Sona as well. Longpor, thank you so much for joining us.
Nice to be with you.
So, Longpor, most of you know, but Longpor Sona was born in Canada in 1954. He embarked on a spiritual journey after encountering Buddhist wisdom. Initially a classical guitarist, he became a lay hermit in British Columbia's Coast Mountain region. In 1989, he ordained as a Theravada monk under Bhante Gunaratana at the Bhavana Society in West Virginia. He further trained for over 3 years at monasteries in the Ajahn Chah tradition in northeast Thailand, particularly Wat Pah Nanachat. Returning to Canada in 1994, Ajahn Sona established Birken Forest Monastery, also known as Siddhavana or Cool Forest Grove, south of Kamloops, BC, after several iterations. After over 30 years in the robes, his closest disciples now refer to him as Longpor, meaning Venerable Father. And that's one of the things he's been to us as we've settled into Seattle. Longpor has been a constant support and guide to us, and we actually get to have him visit us tomorrow. So, Longpor, thank you. But this particular interview, we actually wanted to focus on a video that you recently put out, and wondered if you actually could describe Greek and Persian influence on early Buddhism, and what piqued your interest in this subject, and why did you find it worth delving into?
Yeah, I always had a general curiosity about whether the Greek philosophers and the Buddhists had any interaction. That was a very general and vague curiosity about that. And my impression then was that it's probably lost to obscurity, but I hadn't really investigated it. What I always proposed was that there's a lot of opportunities for PhD students to explore the connections between Greece and India and so forth. And I left it at that because I thought a lot of it was lost in history, but actually it's not. And it is fairly available. So more recently, reading substantial academic books. And first of all, the first thing you need to do is find there's a website that you can get access to the academic papers on this. Academe, edu. Once the magic button is there, you can download every kind of speculation and historical investigation. And then you get a hold of specific books, some of them very substantial. There's the interest in this is waxed and waned over the centuries, actually. So some of it's quite amazing what kind of research and archaeological speculation they had, even in the 18th century. And then, of course, the British Empire. The sun never set on the British Empire. It was all the way around the world. And, of course, India was part of it. And the British, for some reason, were very curious about these older cultures. I think they just had a lot of time on their hands. And so they investigated. Well, they were infected as well with curiosity, science and technology and archaeology and so forth. And it was a bit of a gentleman's leisure pursuit. And they like to bring back things for museums. So they started to speculate and write books. They also got curious about the languages. They recognized that when they encountered certain languages in India, and especially Sanskrit, that it had a lot of common roots with European languages. And this goes back a long ways as well, this recognition. It was more or less like sailors and so forth, Portuguese sailors that were landing in India and realizing they had a few words in common with the natives there. And they're speculating on this. So a lot of research was done on the what are called the Indo-European languages, the connections between them right out as far as India. And then archaeology, they uncovered some incredible runes in the Indus Valley. and it was a lost civilization. And there appeared to be some sort of primitive writing at that time. Nobody has translated the Indus script, by the way, yet. It was lost. And so the British did archaeological studies as well, and they uncovered these Asokan pillars. The Asokan pillars were virtually forgotten, and no, they were in certain areas, and the villagers had no idea what it was or what was written on it either. So it was a British soldier actually who found Asokan pillars in the north that were in Greek and Aramaic, and he then realized that he could translate the ones that are in the south, which were in Brahmi script, and so forth. So this started off a whole series of curious academics, and there's a lot of speculation. When you read widely amongst historians of this whole business, what are the interactions between the ancient cultures? What were the migration routes? What were the interchanges with language, culture, ideas, mythology, etc.? You find a wide spectrum of historians and academics speculating on it. So then, as you go into it, you just can't open a book and presume that that's an accurate picture of it. You have to read quite a few of these and compare them. And as I was reading in these, I started to realize, wait a second, this whole business of writing itself. Now that had always been a preoccupation with me. I couldn't imagine that none of the Buddhist scriptures had ever been written down, and then suddenly the entire thing was written down. The Pali Canon was written down in one go in the Aluvihara in Sri Lanka, and before that, not a word had been written down. I thought, that's not the way monks work. Like, I presumed, I assumed that monks could write. That's mostly wrong. But so as I'm reading more about it, I think, well, let me investigate this more. And then of course, I become aware of these Gandharan scriptures that are surfaced in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And these are like the Dead Sea Scrolls. They're an amazing discovery, and quite recent. Some of them were discovered in the late 1800s, and they recognized that these were Buddhist scriptures on birch bark scrolls, and they've been preserved for more than 2,000 years. And then later on, more collections surfaced, and some of them just in like 2027, and in 1995, a major collection surfaced. And so I got into all of this. Then I had to find out about these scripts. I was rather ignorant about all these scripts, so I ended up taking monitoring a course given by Mark Allen on the Korosti script on the birch bark scrolls. So he was letter by letter showing how you reveal the writings on these birch bark scripts. Unfortunately, it was done in Australia on their time, so it was like well after midnight my time, and I'm watching it on a computer. Just trying to stay awake. It's a 3-hour class on painfully each letter of the Korosti script and how it, this part of this word is missing, so forth. And then, of course, you have in your neighborhood the esteemed Richard Solomon, the professor emeritus, University of Washington, who spent many years translating the scriptures in the Gandharan scriptures in Korosti as well. And he also has some expertise in the Brahmi scripts on the Asokan pillars. Anyway, I was putting all of this together, and I realized, wait a second, the writing, the whole initiative of writing has to be through the Greek monks, the Greeks in the north, because it's just not part of the the middle country. So most of the empire, the Buddhist empire of Asoka is central north east India, that area called Magadha. And there are thousands of monks and thousands of monasteries, and they were keeping it up by memorization. And so then I thought, well, why did they write it down in Sri Lanka? So of course, the only record of this is in two very interesting histories, which are kept in and were written in, and we're very fortunate that they were in the Dipavamsa and the Mahavamsa. And these are Sri Lankan documents. And they're histories. And apparently they were written by monks. Some speculate that they were written by the nuns, actually. But anyway, in there, in a matter of just 2 sentences, they say this is when and why they wrote the entire Pali Canon down. It's a major event in history. And if they hadn't done it, I don't know whether we would know about Buddhism. And they preserved it. They passed it on generations after generations. But we don't have any original scriptures. They're written on old leaves, and Sri Lanka is a humid country, so none of the leaves lasted more than a couple hundred years. So the oldest actual script document that we have in Sri Lanka is maybe 800 years old. And so people ask, well, are you sure that it's how do you know that it's the word of the Buddha, etc., on and on. So then these other scriptures emerge in the northeast, in an area which would have been called Gandhara. And that area happens to be the area where the Greeks and Persians were. The Persians, and strangely enough, the Persians had relocated whole Greek villages to this remote frontier, possibly in the 6th century BC, maybe 550 BC, they got moved over there, deported. This is a big thing that's going on to this day, isn't it? By the way, this involves the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Empire, which would today be Iran. And it's very interesting. This stuff has been going on for thousands of years. The great emperor Cyrus the Great, Cyrus II, I think it was, liberated the Jewish people from the Babylonian rule. And they remember it to this day, and they were allowed to return to Judah, which is kind of a suburb of Israel. And so, yeah, they had a sense of great gratitude to the Grand Persian Emperor, which would be the Iranian leader right now. This is a long time. It's been going on a long time. So I blundered into this before all this trouble was happening in the Middle East. I'm looking at something, trying to figure out what happened 2,500 years ago, and it's still happening. So, yeah, this is what brought me into it. It's not that I don't think I uncovered anything new. So most of everything that I put in that video is fairly substantially documented by mainstream history, archaeology, carbon dating, etc. But a lot of the dots had not been connected, because I'm coming at it from a certain point of view. What I'm interested in is, when were the first European or Westerners involved in Buddhism? And so a lot of the historians who are looking at this don't really connect that. So that's where the dots connect, Yeah. So that's why I started to, wait a sec. This is real. I haven't heard of this. Like, this is where that came from, etc. So these are the connections. I'm just making the connections. Yeah.
Well, Lumpur, I think your technician Meta is just going to tweak a couple things on your side of things for a moment. So Ajahn Nispo and I are just going to briefly speak about what we found, what we enjoyed, what we appreciated about the video. So The name of the video is Greek and Persian Influence on Early Buddhism, the First Western Monks, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes. But I found it quite interesting for a number of reasons. I think my three main takeaways were, as you're talking about now, just the influence of Western writing, even the concept of writing in general, on the development of, actually writing down the Pali Canon, the influence of Western, specifically Greek artwork, statuary, on the development of Buddhist statuary, specifically through Gandhara, and also perhaps the influence of just rationalistic, analytical thought on perhaps the development of Abhidhamma. So those three threads I thought were quite fascinating, and I had just never thought about it before. So I appreciated that.
And similarly, what I found most kind of compelling, first, just, before we'd spoken, I really did think the first time the Buddhist suttas had been written was 2nd century or 1st century CE in Sri Lanka. And the fact that that was actually happening perhaps much earlier. I mean, some of those birch bark scrolls from Gandhara are, 1st century BC copies of older scrolls of the Anatalakkhana Sutta and the Dhammapada. And dating that writing, which actually is when these teachings became written, is when they could split into Abhidhamma and split into Mahayana and these other. It's a lot easier to change a teaching if it's written down. And so that earlier dating kind of made a lot of sense with when, we had these emergence of Abhidhamma or Mahayana to me. And then just the depth of influence of the Greeks. I mean, the statuary you pointed to of the Buddha with Hercules guarding him as a precursor to Vajrapani, I found I'd never seen anything like that. And finally, just this opening up of, there's actually quite an emotional resonance for me with seeing the West's admiration of the Buddha that early on. I was surprised how meaningful that was to kind of see. So,
But before we go into any of that, I'm just curious. One thing I was thinking through the whole of it was, revealing a lot of this quote, forgotten information about the Western influence, on Buddhism very early, perhaps even the earliest generation. You mentioned a couple times in the video that perhaps there were even Greek or Western monks, at the time of the Buddha, which is fascinating to consider. But what is, this is a little bit taboo to talk about in academic circles, but do you have a hope of what actually putting this information into a wider context, a hope for what that might do for Western Buddhist self-perception? Or, do you have a hope in putting this out there? What would you hope that people get out of this?
Well, that's kind of the basic motive, is that we need to, you remember the famous saying by Rudyard Kipling, I think, "East is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet." And this is an imperialist British attitude. And it turns out that the thinking process is not so different at all. They are coming up with similar structures. And the Western mind, as found in Greece, and that's the first, that's the essence of the rational, the initiation of philosophy. As they said about Socrates, that he brought philosophy down from the heavens. Instead of it being religion, it became rational thought about the meaning. How do you conduct your life? What is the good, the true, and the beautiful? And this is the development of rational argument, the Socratic dialogue, and then Aristotle's logic, and so forth. And this is going on in the discussions that the monks are having out in the parks, and they're primarily in argument with Brahmins and a few other philosophical schools. And those philosophical schools are very similar to the Greek schools. There's skeptics, there's materialists. So this is another area where So the idea, for instance, of rebirth and karma, often in the West, with academics in the West, they say, well, the Buddha was just born in that culture where there's rebirth and karma, and so he just presumed that that was the case, and etc. But they seem to not have read the suttas, because there's all these philosophers who have absolute denial of karma and rebirth, and the Buddha's arguing, he says, no, that's not what I'm saying. And then in terms of karma, again, there's no equivalent to the nature of the redefinition of the word karma by the Buddha does not precede him. You find this word in the Vedas and in some of the Upanishads and so forth, but it's not what the Buddha means by this word. He's brought it back to a personal ethic and personal consequences for the individual, and that it's taken out of this ancient world's religious view where they're dealing always with mysterious, invisible forces, the gods, and they're making sacrifices. They're slaughtering animals to the gods and so forth. And this is, they're not rational. It's purely authoritarian. It's you don't have, the ordinary person has no access to the information that the priest class has and so forth. You see it all across the ancient world. That's how they're functioning. So the two places where a breakthrough is made, one is in Greece with these philosophers, and they're earlier than Socrates as well. So they're also, Democritus is a materialist philosopher, and he believes that there's only atoms and space. That's all there is. That's very modern. And there's others arguing against it and so forth. Plato himself, Socrates, are aspiring to some sort of beautiful, their philosophy is at the service of some aspiration to the highest possibility of the human soul, etc. So that's very close to what the Buddha is developing. So there's this parallel there. But this casual dismissal of, well, that was the ethos of the time. So you see, generally in what is called secular Buddhism, where you just extract out the juicy parts that you like and is compatible with science of the late 20th century or something, and you leave the rest aside, and then you give an explanation why you do that, because the Buddha was just a product of his culture. He believed in this because everybody believed in it. No, it turns out, no, that's not the case at all. So I want people to have access to this information. It was very obscure before. First of all, hardly anybody was interested. The West was dominated by interest in Greek philosophy, Roman philosophy, European philosophy. And most of that philosophy was buried in layers of Christianity as well. So it's only in the last couple hundred years that you start to see fresh thought in Europe. And some of that fresh thought is initiated by exposure to Buddhist ideas. You see in Schopenhauer, he is a very influential German philosopher in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And he is aware of both Hindu and Buddhist thought, and it radically changes him. He's not a Christian, and he starts putting these ideas out, and it's a revelation for people. The other guy is who's the skeptic philosopher, the Scottish skeptic philosopher. I forget his name now.
Hume,
who came up with the question: is there a self? Is there really a self? And this also is actually, it's very interesting. There is a trace that possibly he encountered, and this is late 1700s. This is actually before Immanuel Kant. So he apparently might have encountered this Buddhist idea of no self, and then he's given credit in the West as the first person who proposes to question the reality of this idea of a fixed identity, this etc. But I think he got it. He was in the air. Something drifted towards him. There's a very interesting paper exploring this connection. A woman, actually, a woman in California who is a professor. I think she's a professor of psychology. When she heard about this idea of no self when she came to Buddhism, she said, that reminds me of a philosopher in the West that also had this idea, and I wonder if he had any influence. And so she began to investigate that and found out that he actually spent, his name is Hume. The philosopher's name is Hume. And he's a skeptic philosopher. So and he comes up with this idea of perhaps the self does not exist. And turns out he spent time in a seminary in France with a Jesuit preacher who had spent time in Thailand. This is in the 1700s. And this Jesuit, as you know, the Jesuits are a very scholarly segment of the Catholic Church, and he had found out about this doctrine that the Buddhists had. He learned to speak Thai and probably a little Pali as well, as they did. They were very brilliant scholastic missionaries. And he had shared this idea with Hume that they say that there is no self. And Hume is a skeptic, and he is a free thinker, and he then proposes this, and this becomes a famous moment in Western history. But he never gives the source of this. But she traced it that he had spent time in that seminary with that Jesuit priest who had been a missionary in Thailand. So she thinks there's the connection. So we're connecting these things. It's a worldwide thing. These thoughts are ricocheting around the world. And we want to not separate the East and the West so much. I mean, so that's why the video really starts with showing Western monks. The first Western monks in the late 1800s, a few very adventurous types becoming Buddhist monks in Sri Lanka or Burma. Apparently there was a German monk even in the 1860s in Thailand. And so, but that's all we know. But voila, thousands of years before, there were numerous Greek monks in the robes. Towards the end of the video, I'm speculating more about how many and how widespread was this? Because every now and then somebody says, oh yeah, there's a Ionica or a Greek monk mentioned on the Asokan pillars. Maybe there was one. But you see some scholars unearthing all kinds of Buddhist influence in the Greek community in the north. And large numbers, it's thought, were converted or devotional to Buddhism. There's a professor of archaeology, history, and Indian history and so forth, named Mariko Walters at Harvard. And she is, I quote her in the end, that she says, there's been a sort of a diminution of the amount of people involved in this, in this Greek area, the Gandharan area of north. But she says, I think it was large, massive numbers of people were involved in the Buddhist community. And you see these giant monasteries there, and all kinds of statuary, whole factory towns producing thousands of these Buddha images. So this is what I wanted to get at. As well, there's Indian nationalism. Like there's what happened, India was a colony of the British Empire. And in 1948, they get independence. And since that time, they've been trying to form their national identity. And one of their points of pride is that they're the inventors of Sanskrit. They originate all kinds of things in India, and they're claiming that some of these ideas that are in Europe came from India, and they're very resistant to the idea of this. A bunch of ideas like Buddha statues came actually from the Greeks. So when I talk about where these Buddha statues arise, there's a whole school that talks about an area called Mathura, Mathura, where you do find sort of statuary from an early time, but these statues are yaksha statues. So the yakshas, these kind of spirits, nature spirits, like the yeti, and the Sasquatch, and so spirit animals in the trees and so forth. And there's tree worship as well. So they did carve these things kind of like, I don't know whether protective kind of things or honoring them or whatever, but they're very crude. And the Mathura statuary is very crude. And there's a legend that a Buddhist nun from Mathura got the first Buddha image carved and then wanted to distribute it, so forth. But what you see in the actual statuary is that it's very advanced, very sophisticated, and it's very Greek on a large scale. And it's in the north, in these towns that become virtual factory towns of statuary. And then as time goes on, the locals blend their sense of style to it. So you get Greek-Indian blends of these statuaries. So you'll see this. You go to Thailand, there's a range. Well, around the world, you see a huge range of statuary. And some of it's very crude, depending on the quality of the artists. Some very sophisticated, some very Asian, some very more Greek styles, etc. And Roman, by the way, so the Romans were there as well. The Roman statue carvers were there as well. That's a bit later. By the way, so this is the first video, so it's an hour and 24 minutes long. It took a long time to get the studies. And then Metta, who's behind the camera right now, spent 6 months finding all the imagery and looking in the museums for all of these statues and coins and locations of monasteries. So this takes a long time. Remember, we're just a shoestring operation up here. We have it takes up a lot of our time to do this.
Yeah.
But now that we've done this, I'm kind of thinking that there will be a next one, which more to do with later influences from east to west, in India and Buddhist influences moving to the west, and there's a huge area to cover there.
That's fascinating, and yet clearly a labor of love. Just real quick, I want to give Ajahn Nisbo a chance to ask a question, but I'm curious what you might say. You mentioned like the Indian nationalism, or really you find nationalism in any Buddhist country. People saying, the Buddha came to Thailand and the Buddha came to Sri Lanka, or the Buddha came to Burma, and there's a lot of that sentiment. What would you say to someone who responds to your video suggesting that you have your own cultural bias? Like you're just wanting to see, Greek because you're a Western person, so you're interpreting the data to support your own bias.
Yeah, I probably am. I do. I tell you at the end of the video, maybe I tell you at the beginning that what I'm interested here is to show the Western connection, that it's not separated. And when doing that, I want to be careful not to myth make. I'm not trying to generate a myth here or deny some very clear evidence. So there's so I got several letters after the video came out. By the way, it's very popular. What is 15,000 views or so now after 3 days, So it breaks out the bounds of Buddhist interest. So if you just have Buddhism in the title, that's one audience. And then when you have Persian, Greek, Buddhism, India, there's a larger audience, especially for like historical things. So more people are interested for other reasons. And so I did get a few letters to the office here about
Critique.
objecting to a few things. One of them was to do with my. I'm just. It really has. I have not really any particular interest in the Persian Greek connection, except to show the nature of these, how to make an empire, and the nature of Cyrus's what he carved on these pillars, which the Asokan pillars are models of. You know, they're imitating Persian Achaemenid Empire statuary.
Mhm.
So one of the things I said was that Cyrus, and I'm just reading from history, Cyrus has liberated the Jews from the Babylonian captivity and brought them back to Judah and to Israel. And I get a very accusative letter about that I'm trying to justify the Jewish occupation of the Palestinian. That it's a hot issue. So I get a little accusation I'm being funded by the Israel. Honest, not a penny. And other so there's a lot of national interests floating around in the Tamil area of southern India. They have this, some of them believe that that's where the earliest script is, that precedes the Brahmi script that you find in the Asokan pillars. So in general, Western historians and archaeologists say, basically there's no evidence of writing in India before the Asokan pillars, and they just appear and they're there. So that's 268 BC. That's Asoka's era. Maybe 250 he had them carved. There are no traces of writing before that. But in the Tamil area, there's this belief that they have an earlier script. They had a Tamili kind of script, and they're in caves and so forth. But most of the serious archaeologists say that actually is just a variant. It's just a variant of Brahmi. It's a Tamil variant of Brahmi. It's not an original script. It's not earlier than the Brahmi, etc. You have some pottery found in Sri Lanka that's supposed to have Brahmi on it, and it's supposed to be two centuries before the Asokan pillars. But then, so you look that up and think, wow, that's amazing. But then archaeologists say, well, actually, the carbon dating that they used is contaminated by, it was done carelessly, and it's contaminated by earlier layers, and it doesn't represent earlier scriptures than the Brahmi from the Asokan pillars. So you have to wade through this, but people are forming national identities around these things, these claims. So they're very, it's a kind of political, nationalistic belief system. So you have to tippy-toe around this a bit. But at the same time, you can't pretend that the information is true. It's not true. The other area is that, of course, there is a script 1,000 years before the Brahmi, 1,500 years before the Brahmi.
Mm.
In India, this is called Indus, the Indus script. And there was a whole civilization, very advanced civilization in the Indus Valley.
Mm-hmm.
And it's probably the largest city in the world at the time. And it was absolutely lost and covered over. And it's only archaeologists and excavations in the last couple hundred years that recovered this. And then they found some statuary too. So there's a famous little small statue of what they call the priest. And they have no idea if he was a priest or not. They just call it that. I don't know. They really don't know much about this place, except they've unearthed the place had sewer systems and water systems and advanced building structures and some kind of script. And this script is this Indus script, and it's 1,500 years before script appears in India. So people will write to me and say, well, what about the Hindu script? You don't know about that, do you? You know, blah, blah, blah. So I do know about that. And nobody has translated it, although dozens of people have claimed to for the last 50 or 60 years, one after another. Brilliant guy in his mother's basement has translated the Hindu script and claimed that they know what it is, and it's Sanskrit, of course. No. Turns out no. Why do they come up with Sanskrit? Because that's also a point of national pride, that Sanskrit is this absolutely advanced language that has originated in India with the Vedas. So that's a deep point of nationalistic pride in India. And the whole contemporary, the party it's a bit of the rather right-wing party that's ruling India right now. They're very, this is the true Dharma. They have a terminology for it that they use, Hindutva Dharma. You know, it's the real Dharma. And Sanskrit is the ultimate language. But when we look at it closely, it turns out very, unfortunately, that we find evidence of Sanskrit migrating from what is called the Ukraine today. Early versions of it came with migrants from that area. But it did indeed develop in India and became to a high point. The Sanskrit was developed to a high point. But there's a sense of it's the whole philosophy is called out of India. You know, that our basic view of where humans came from is called out of Africa. And wave after wave came out of Africa, sort of the original place. And wave after wave came out of Africa hundreds of thousands of years ago. None of them survived. And the last wave that came out, which virtually populates the world now, is something about 50 or 60,000 years ago that managed to survive. And that spread. But there are myths in India, nationalistic myths in India, that it's from India that everything arose from this. But they're not anchored in hardcore archaeology, etc., or genetic studies. So this is why we know in the recent times, genetic studies have come along so much that in the last 10 years that we start to see incredible depth of connections back hundreds or even thousands of generations.
So Longpor, to dive into another fraught topic, but one I think is quite significant with the implications of this research. Two kind of movements in Buddhism are largely predicated on writing. And I mentioned these before, but first the Abhidhamma, which composes one of the three baskets in the Pali Canon, and in the various different Buddhist canons, and which is composed of matrices and what are called matikas, and kind of a very detailed analysis of various Dhamma points, which almost necessitates writing to put down into thought. And the second is, and this is the controversial point perhaps, but the emergence of the Mahayana, and the fact that before writing, the suttas were passed on through group recitation, which was very hard to actually change. I mean, if you're reciting with 30 other monks and one monk gets a word wrong, the other 29 are going to correct them. But as soon as writing emerges, then there really is this potential for a single scribe to shift a whole sutta or whole lineage. And with the idea that the writing of the Tripitaka first happened in Sri Lanka in 1st century CE, the emergence of the Abhidhamma in 2nd or 1st century BCE, or the emergence of the Mahayana around the turn of the Common Era, didn't make much sense. But with the implications of writing emerging in Gandhara with the Greek influence, the fact that the Mahayana emerged there actually begins to make a lot of sense. And not that there isn't profound wisdom in the Mahayana, obviously there is, but I'm curious, would you draw out how much weight do you put in those implications in terms of how writing influenced the emergence of the Abhidhamma and the Mahayana?
Yeah, I think that it is the Greek connection. There should be a movie called The Greek Connection, like the Spanish Connection kind of thing. It's they're bringing something that's recognizable from the Greek process, analytical thinking, and also abstract thinking. The Greeks are this. So this is something in human history as well, abstract thinking, and this is where mathematics comes from, and also geometry. The Greeks, found the foundations of their mathematics is geometric foundations. So for them, 2 times 2 is based on a square, and that's why you get the area of a square. It's 2 times 2. It gives you 4. And that's how you get the area of a square. And they're deriving their math from these geometrical ideas. And if you go to Plato's Academy, his grove, there's a sign above the door, and those who are ignorant of geometry do not enter here. Somehow geometry is intrinsic to philosophy for Plato. And he goes through I think it's 10 various shapes. You can derive 10 geometric shapes. And this is abstract thinking. And this is brought then to, has an effect on how you think. So when we send children to school and they're taught arithmetic, it will always be 1 apple, and 1 apple is 2 apples. It won't be 1 and 1 is 2, because 1 what and 2 what? That's not how we work. We're very concrete. Most people are very concrete. They're not abstract. So they need things that we're talking. Are you talking about things here? 2 things? Yes. But you can generate a new way of cortex development where you don't even need the things anymore. You just have the numbers. Mm. So this is what's happening. And this also changes people's way of thinking. And this is, by the way, deeply connected with the idea of money. Money is just abstract symbol. You got a number in a bank book, and this is suddenly your wish can be granted because you have a certain number in this. So this is, I always think this is the origin of the Aladdin's lamp. The genie. You rub the lamp, and the genie appears and gives you the wishes. What is that lamp? It's really just abstract. The ability to accumulate money. It's a new idea. Instead of I give you a deer carcass and you give me a spear, we exchange things, but somehow I end up giving you a chunk of slate, and you make a mark on it. And so now we've just done the deal, but it's all abstract. So this changes everything. It's abstract thinking, and this is what you find in Abhidhamma is abstract thinking. They're able to take things apart. I mean, in the suttas you find this. You see reductionism as well. The 32 parts of the body, and the 4 elements, and so forth. When you get into Abhidhamma, they take it down to the maximum amount. They divide it into all of the possible parts that you could possibly imagine. This is the abstract thinking taken to its conclusion. This is characteristic of Greeks as well. And so it would have come very naturally. But in the Mahayana in the north, you see that there are these two brothers that are kind of the ones that are developing certain kinds of thoughts. Asanga and his brother, I can't remember the other guy's name, but they're moving towards this emptiness idea. The emptiness of not just the absence of self, but that all of the khandhas and any element that you can think of is insubstantial as well, is without real entity. And this is kind of a metaphysical breakthrough. It's philosophical. This reminds me of these paradoxes that the Greeks have. The paradox of motion. You know, that if a rabbit, a hound is pursuing a rabbit, they have to, you can never catch the rabbit or the tortoise, the rabbit and the tortoise.
Arrow.
The rabbit has to cover half the distance to the tortoise before it catches it, and then it has to cover half of that distance and half of that distance and half the distance. And then therefore it could never catch the tortoise. Theoretically, because there's an infinite number of divisions that you can make. So this is a Greek thinking much earlier than the time of the Abhidhamma. This is kind of thinking which leads to the deep doctrine of emptiness, which becomes the primary center of Mahayana thinking as well. And some would say that it kind of has moved from a religion into kind of abstract philosophy at that point. So it's empty and so those brothers were from the Gandhara region. They would have been influenced. This is 3rd century, 2nd century, 3rd century CE of the Christian era. We're still using CE and BC for Buddhist things. I don't know. So this is they could have come up with it independently. That type of thinking could have just been a Buddhist thing, but why not? The Greeks were there, so it well could be influenced by that. They're intermingling. So, and then you see what the connections are, that Hercules becomes a bodhisattva, Vajrapani, and then possibly Avalokiteshvara. And weirdly and interestingly, Avalokiteshvara gradually transforms into a woman, into Kuan Yin. You see this migration of Greek heroes and gods into bodhisattva kind of material. And of course, a lot of that develops in China, and China is still integrating Buddhism, what they get in North India, with Taoist and Confucian ideas as well. And that permeates into all kinds of different subsects of the Mahayana, and some are very devotional, and they're praying to Maitreya. The future Buddha becomes the bodhisattva that you actually get direct aid from. The Shakyamuni has gone, is not to be found, but Maitreya is in a certain heaven, and you can actually maybe get favors or something from that. So this is migrating back and changing and so forth in the cultures. But what I'm interested in is, because we have a lot of information about how Buddhism changed as it went to China and Japan and etc. But what about the early, very before any of that, the Europeans are involved. Yeah.
Lamport, I think it would be fascinating hearing about all these influences and cross influences. It would be fascinating and awesome if archaeologists in Athens were to uncover and find that inscription above the academy's door, and it turns out it's in the Pali language in Brahmi script. That would be awesome. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, we're fine. We are there. There are now they are finding things like that in Egypt, in cult sanctuaries. They're finding Buddha images that were imported from the Middle East. They weren't imported from India. They weren't brought from India. The marble or the stone that they're carved from is Middle Eastern stone. So all throughout the Persian Empire, before the arrival of Islam, Buddhist monks were there. And so there is some very good books on Buddhism in Iran. Now, again, this is a national thing, and was a deliberate attempt to eradicate previous religious ideas and philosophies from evidence in the entire culture. So, but there's still street names like Bihar, which is where the Vihara, that's where the Buddhist monks lived, and it's forgotten that was the word that the monks used. That's where the Vihara is. It's Bihar now.
Yeah.
But of course, again, you find I did mention it in the film. The Kshatriya caste, the warrior caste, that's a Persian word. It's a loan word from the Persians. And that is, of course, what the Shah of Iran is, the Kshatriya caste. That's the warrior caste in the Persian Empire. And they borrow that Persian word for the Kshatriyas in India. So you have a lot of Persian loan words in the Pali language. When you look at even a cursory look at the word, the counting to 10 in Pali, you'll see that it's obviously has roots in the Indo-European languages, eka, dve, ti, chataro, etc. These are, eka, uno, dve is duo kind of thing. And you'll see variants of it very close to that. T is 3, and in Sanskrit, tree, tri, tricycle, same in Latin, Greek, etc. Chattaro is quattro, pancha is pentangle, penta, all the way up. They're share. It's obviously these are common words for these numbers, and they have an Indo-Aryan root. So actually, I just finished a book by a scholar, a woman called, what's it called? Proto. The book is called Proto, and it's about the Proto-Indo-European language, the ultimate. Where did all of these languages come from? A Proto language, and what was that language, and who were those people, and how did that language manage to spread all the way to India, and all the way to Ireland, etc. And it's all has roots in that, and that Proto-Indo-Aryan language is rooted in this Yanmaya tribe, I guess, in the steppes in the Ukraine area.
We arranged to get a copy of that book for you.
Through there. What's that?
We arranged to get a copy of that book for you, but since you've already read it, maybe we'll give it to Ajahn Sona. So.
Yeah, well, it's nice to have a hard copy. I just have it on my Kindle, so I instantly read the whole thing. I was very interested in that.
Excuse me.
And right now, I'm reading another one for your your audience, if they're interested in, is The Golden Road by William Dalrymple. And he is a great writer to begin with. He's, I think he's Scottish, an Oxfordian kind of guy, and he's written a number of books on history. But he's right on the same. I find, and I hadn't read that book before my video, and he's right on the same thing, and he's saying, those the pillars in Persia, that's what those Asokan pillars probably are, and he's like, I thought of that first. So, yeah, that's a good read to see this incredible connection throughout Europe and Asia through the Golden Road, which is through the Gandharan region. And he goes into all the statuary, etc. So that just came out about a month ago. And it's a superb read.
You're outlining in the video the sort of link of these Western writing or these modes of thought to the East is meaningful. And I think I will be interested in, the sequel where we get to look into the Eastern influence on the West. And just to point out some parallels you've touched on in previous videos, there's the Church of Saint Josaphat, which was the Christian accidentally taking on the Bodhisattva as a saint, which is a brilliant story. And then, just these confluences with Socrates speaking about what seems to be the deathless. And, we have another interview or 8, which we could do on that. I do think we have to wrap up here, though. On behalf of, all of us Buddhists in the Pacific Northwest and elsewhere, just thank you for the video, Long Persona. It's significant. And to Metta behind the camera. Yeah. So
Pacific Northwest and the West in general.
That too.
Yeah.
Right. And I'll see you tomorrow.
And
yes.
we'll post a link into the chat for Zoom for people who want to join us over there for more intimate conversation.
Right.
And for those who haven't watched the video yet, we'll that we've been talking about this whole time, we'll post it into the chat or the description. You can read it there. Thank you, Long Por.
Okay.